this one is a little more poignant, and talk about going from formative time as a kid to leaping right into the war in Vietnam. And um, tell us about your inspiration for writing about this. Why did this become meaningful for you? Really personally, it was a challenge, I know, but it also was something that brought something out of you that you didn't even know you had.
I think maybe the catalyst for it was, I remember going into the building and I wrote in a diary that had started, the thick gray door closed and all noise was gone, and I knew my life would never be the same. About a year or two before the book came up, someone I knew was going down to, now I can't think of the name of the church that sponsors the homeless shelter, but now it's a homeless shelter. And we're getting close to that area, and I'm having this premonition that this might be the same building where I went into the Army. And so it was like all of a sudden I've gone full circle, 48 years later, and it was just, created something in me that kind of maybe got the gears spinning and thinking about it a little bit. And I had kept part of a diary, but most of it was illegible after all these years writing on both sides of the page. The ink ran through and you couldn't really read it, but I'd reread parts of it. And, once I started thinking about it, it was just a catharsis. Well, actually, the way it started, now I remember, was I took a photo, and you have that photo, and posted it on Facebook just because I thought this might be something people have never seen. And the way people responded really caught me off guard. They were thanking me and extremely grateful, and I had never experienced anything like that. And I almost, get emotional now just thinking about it. And so I wrote about that experience, and then that experience expanded into the, all the other parts of what I wrote about.
The earlier chapter about your childhood, and then this chapter, really, these two straddle the 2 decades that Monica was referencing. And boy, how did it change your life? I mean, it was a huge change for you, and just the process of writing about it was an experience in itself. This is one of the photos that you brought to the book from your own personal collection. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, that was after the ammunition dump. It was during the 1968 Tet Offensive, and I was in the 1st Cavalry Division, which was about 20,000 troops. In the area that it covered, it was in northern part of South Vietnam. It was almost the size of Magnolia, and it had a small airfield on it. But the ammunition dump was hit by a Vietnamese rocket. It was right around early evening, and it set off the whole ammunition dump. I wrote in the book, and I mentioned there was 3 gigantic explosions, and I think it was 3 million or 7 million pounds of explosives all cooking off at one time in these 3 separate explosions. But it wiped out all the people that were stationed close to the ammunition dump, and they were running through the night with the shrapnel just flying through the air. And we were in this bunker. There's what you can see, a small hole on the left, and that's where you entered it. It was made for like maybe 12 people, and we had probably 50 in there, just like sardines. It was very uncomfortable for about 8 hours, just all smashed together. But it was, the company commander was in there. He got a communication over the walkie-talkie that the base was being overrun, shoot to kill. And I was right near the entrance, and there were these, people from other companies who their bunkers were even destroyed, looking for shelter. And so, I'm screaming, "Don't shoot them." And so all these people poured into our bunker, and we just were in there for about 8 hours. And I think this was in the morning after everything was over, and we were eating some sea rations.
Tell us about your experience with the helicopters as well.
well, it was the Chinook Company, and the Chinooks were used to, haul troops, to haul supplies. They were used a lot to pick up downed aircraft. They would sling load them underneath, and the nickname was, they called them the Hook because they just used a hook to sling load their loads. They used them on some real diabolical missions. One was 50-gallon drums that were just rolled out the back. We did, they said it was CS gas or tear gas. We don't know what it was. Another time there were these like polypropylene donuts with a serrated knife blade sticking up on each side. So no matter which way they landed, this barbed knife was sticking straight up.
Yeah.
And they dropped those throughout the jungle. One mission I went on was we would sling load 50-gallon drums of aviation fuel or diesel fuel underneath the helicopter and just hover over a suspected enemy location and then drop it, and it would detonate on contact. But it was an early morning, and we were near the coast like you see in this photo,
right?
But a bank of fog, and as we got down lower, we were in this fog and clouds. And I had mentioned in the book that I thought only weak-minded people, experienced vertigo. Well, I seriously couldn't tell if I was upside down or right side up. I couldn't, gravity didn't have any play anymore. If I was the pilot, it would have been a bad thing. But we were able to, the pilots were, didn't experience that and dropped out, and we were out of there. There was one mission that was, I think, the last thing that I wrote, and as I put the pieces together, and your memory is kind of vague from way back then, but I put all these pieces together, and I was scared on this mission because it was just horrible weather. But as I put all the pieces together, it was more terrifying. That by doing the math, as far as the time in the air, we had to have been in Laos, which we weren't supposed to be. We picked up about 120 Vietnamese soldiers. The aircraft was made to carry 33 American soldiers with their combat gear. The Vietnamese were stacked like cordwood in the back. Jeez. And it was extremely turbulent. It was beyond weather that you would normally ever fly in. We were overloaded, and it didn't even have the power to maintain a steady altitude, and we were just being thrown up and down sideways. These people were flying around. When, putting all the pieces together, I was scared during that time, but I thought nothing of it once we landed and got out of the aircraft, and just thought that was a little bit scary. But when I, at my age now, and think of put the pieces together, it was, almost a miracle that we made it, it seemed like. And I believe there probably could have been more aircraft to pick up the Vietnamese, but for some reason, maybe they didn't want to risk more than one aircraft, and the pilots weren't going to say we can only take, 33. They took everybody. But that was an experience that was one of the scarier ones. Another time we would go down to Da Nang. There was such a contrast in the war where we were living in tents and being rocketed all the time. Of course, as I will relate, at Da Nang we were rocketed again, but going down there, it was like a regular city. I ended up riding around on a bus throughout the city just to see what it looked like, with no weapon. I write about a Vietnamese woman holding a baby, and both her clothes and the baby's clothes were just ragged. And what a contradiction between the beauty of this woman and the baby, and then seeing razor wire behind her, and the dichotomy of the two just was a picture that I can never forget.
You're certainly exemplifying the fact that when you start writing about something, things become more concrete and they're not as foggy in your memory anymore.
Right.
And to wrap up this section, I know that there's an element of this that's important for you to tell, and that is reflected in the chapter, and that is, what was Magnolia like for you when you came back from Vietnam?
I rented a house on Perkins Lane for $75 a month. And it was the house later sold for 29,000, and it had a high bank, but it went all the way down to the water.
Yeah.
And I, moved in there shortly thereafter, and I started work at the spaghetti factory and worked as a waiter. And so we would go out and, party every night after
Yeah.
work and use up our tip money, the $30 a night we would make in tips.
But Magnolia wasn't the same old Magnolia as when you were a little kid.
Right. My life was totally different. I was an only child. My parents were overprotected of me. There was the Navy pool down in Interbay. My parents wouldn't even let me go down there to swim because they didn't feel I was supervised well enough.
Yeah.
So here I am, in Vietnam and in the Army. Just, you couldn't have had a bigger change or somebody more naive. But I think that was true of a lot of people.
Well, it's a story that people can really relate to through your eyes.
I just wanted to mention one more thing about Da Nang. We would go down there and get beer and soda, and they would be stored in shipping containers when we got back to where we were at. But we normally wouldn't stay overnight, but this night we stayed overnight. We were hit by rockets or mortars, and normally would run into the bunker. We go running. All these people were in a barracks that they weren't used to. We go running outside in what appeared to be a bunker. We went in, but it hadn't been finished. There was no PSP metal plating over the top and sandbags. So it was just like an open hole. And all these rockets are being walked in, and you hear the shrapnel hitting the buildings. And it was just, a terrifying experience, not knowing if you were going to live or die and that you couldn't do anything about it. Normally when you were in the bunkers, if you were going to be hit by a rocket, you wouldn't know about it. Couldn't see anything. But this time, we could see and hear everything. Well, it was a contrast because I'm looking up at the black sky and the stars. And I remember before I left for Vietnam being with this girl, and we were out walking at night and looking up at the stars, and here the contrast is so great that it couldn't be more different.
It's another example of a vivid story that people can relate to.